labels like racist and bigot. That is essentially what this resolution does. It uses words like culturally offensive, non-discriminatory practices, which are simply what it's saying, the word that seemed to be on everyone's mind during open forum, racist, bigot. If we're going to play who's offended, I think I'm offended. I'm offended that a school and state that I care deeply about is being characterized as discriminatory and uninclusive for an act that 4 students had no idea could be offensive to members of the Lakota tribe. As for the clause dealing with the origin of the nickname Sooners, I did some reading. On April 22nd, 1889, 50,000 people swarmed the Oklahoma Territory to claim their 160 acres of land. This was part of the 1862 Homestead Act that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, and I think we can agree he was one of the more racially progressive politicians of his time. To say that the Sooners has a historical connection to Native American culture is like saying the name Huskers has the same historical connection. We took this land to harvest. Sooners took the land to drill for oil. I guess the New England Patriots have the same historical connection since they were the original culprits of stealing land from the Native Americans. It is all too easy to sit here and call this bigotry, uninclusiveness, racism. I'm taking the less comfortable position, and I encourage the Senate to look past the emotional charge of the supporting arguments and look at this with an eye of objectivity. Thank you.
Senator Boren.
I'd just like to start by saying that I completely disagree with everything Senator Kelly just said. Secondly, I think it's important for us to recognize we passed the diversity strategic development plan, and like we're bound by that. Like we passed it, we agreed on it. It's something that we passed and that we are committed to as a Senate and therefore as a student body through our representation. Secondly, I think that creating logical fallacy arguments and it's just not okay with me. Like, I think we need to draw on common sense for this issue. It's no one's trying to throw students under the bus. Of course, we're not trying to do that, and I don't think either of these bills do that. What I do think is extremely important, though, is that we recognize that this action is not okay with us as a student senate representing students who were deeply offended by this. And it shouldn't be okay for our university, for us to stand by and let this happen at athletic events. After it happened the first time, there should have been a response from the athletic department, from the university community, possibly even from us to prevent this from happening a second time, and it didn't happen. And so, we're playing catch up as it is, and I think it's completely unacceptable for us to say that this is not a bill that we would support. And with that said, I would like to yield time to one of our guests.
Hi, I spoke at the forum. My name is Mike Dunn. If you miss me, I'm co-chair of PSC. I'd just like to address what Senator Kelly was saying before. First, I would like to take issue with the fact that the history of the headdress is not about Native Americans. It's about children running around pretending to be Indians, quote unquote. There's a logical flaw in that the fact that the idea that children can run around playing cowboys and Indians is not necessarily a cultural sensitive one. The incident that happened at the football game is an example of hate speech, period. The intent does not matter. If I went over and drew a swastika on the wall, and I was like, no, it's okay, I'm not trying to offend Jewish people, I'm just trying to make a point, that wouldn't be okay with anybody in this room. The idea that intent should matter is not one that is a logical argument, because we don't know what the intent was. So for all we know, they were trying to be offensive. We don't know anything about it, but we do know the act was an offensive one, and speaking as co-chair of PSC, I'd like to say that one at PSC is not okay with it, and I'd like to say that a lot of the student body would find that offensive.
Internal Vice President Coburn.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, I worked very hard on this. I apologize to the Senate and to the student body in general because I had hoped to write a letter to the editor of the DN in order to talk about issues of cultural sensitivity and how we have a long way to go. Unfortunately, I've been dealing with a lot of issues outside of this issue, and I was not able to do that. So I apologize in advance. Hopefully that will come soon. I also worked very hard to find a lot of other issues that are things that we need to address. This one is great for me because it pointed out something that I just didn't understand. I'm going to go into a little story that will help you understand why I didn't understand and why I'm mad at myself for not understanding right when I saw this. When I was a freshman, I had a gay roommate, and that was different for me. That was definitely different. I came from a town of 10,000. I didn't understand the history of words that had to do with him, do with his orientation, sexual orientation. So one day when I was mad at him, he walked in, and I just was, I was mad. I was gonna kid with him like I did with all my friends back home. And I turned around and I called him a bae. And it hit me at that moment that that was unacceptable. I didn't quite understand why it was so unacceptable, but I don't blame myself for that at that moment because I was not given the opportunity to understand where he was coming from until I had met him. And people make mistakes, and they learn from those mistakes, and they fix those mistakes, and it's a process. Things take time. The point is that things take time. I would also note that that's kind of my way of getting into this and saying that I think it's unacceptable that I didn't do something about this right away. So to unite to the individuals who came here earlier, I apologize. The vote in exec committee was 8-6. One of the individuals who left would have voted in the other side, so it would have been 8-7. And actually, the other person, one of the individuals who voted in the affirmative, has actually, to my knowledge, changed his opinion. We'll see what comes out tonight. I think that gives good reason why you see two bills here tonight. I've believed in transparency since I got into ASUN. I believe in the Senate being able to make decisions for themselves. After this, I will probably sit back and listen to you all talk and enjoy it because I think you guys have a lot to say on this issue, and that makes me very happy because it's a very important issue. So I would just note that my intent with pushing for a second bill to come up is not to undermine the first. It is to provide discussion and perspective on the issues. The idea that putting more examples on the back is limiting in any way or more limiting than putting one example, I think is, I just think we argue about the silliest things. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. That is there to show that number one, I am going to put in effort into this when it all comes to whatever it comes to, whatever bill passes. I'm going to put a lot of effort into it. I stayed up very late that night when I had other things to do to make sure that all came together. And I hope that's taken into account as you look at these things. We need to look at everything when we look at this issue. That's why when this came up, I thought I'd learned my lesson when I lived with my roommate, and I obviously hadn't. But I'm determined not to allow that to happen again, and that's why those examples are there, and that's why I think that it's best to broaden our perspective on this issue. I helped co-author the Diversity Strategic Development Plan. It's good as we could get, but it wasn't giving reasonable expectations to students, and I think that is hugely important. I can't emphasize enough from where I've come from to understand how important reasonable expectations are when we're trying to work with one another. It's just as important, and I know that people are going to disagree with me on this, but not many people have sat in my spot. I feel constantly discriminated against on one issue, but we won't go into that. But I think that it's just as important for the individuals who get discriminated against to recognize the difficulties of the other side in order to move forward. And I feel like Unite has done that very, very well. It's not a point against them. I'm just stating that as we move forward and we decide whether or not we're going to specify this specific issue in our process, that whether or not that's an okay thing to do, and showing that we truly understand the situations that people are in. I think that intent is very important. I can't express how much I don't like the fact that we can't understand what's offensive about each culture, but I think that it's